Hey there, Dayland with another random making encounter, and today a project that I've been trying to get to for a long time. I've always wanted to make a Pirates of the Caribbean Nook, and I just was struggling to find some key components, namely a skeleton that I could use that was realistic enough and configurable and modifiable enough. I looked for all sorts of toys and scale skeletons, but everything was just too big for a Nook. Thankfully, I did find one that could be 3D printed, and with a little bit of hacking and a little bit of super glue, I was able to kludge one together for a project. The one big challenge around this particular project was that it is an enclosed space. It has 4 walls, and I wanted to have the sense of a larger environment. I think book nooks or nooks that are rooms are perhaps a little bit easier than things that are an open environment, because you have to disguise and hide and fake this sense of bigger space in a very confined box, basically. So a lot of struggle, a lot of figuring out how to hide walls and blend walls and disguise things. But in the end, I think it worked pretty well. So without any more chit-chat, let's just jump right into the project. So this is kind of a double wide diorama, book nook shelf insert, whatever we want to call them these days. I needed more space. There was a lot of stuff that's going to go in this, and just having a normal narrow format that's pretty common for a lot of other inserts just wasn't going to work for this one. I usually build an inner box for the box, which sounds a little like overkill, but realistically, creating walls inside the Nook helps in a bunch of ways. It really allows you to get into the Nook itself without having to worry about working within a box. You can build up 2 or 3 walls at a time, and it will allow you, when you need to create space for wiring, lighting, doorways, windows, things like that. I'm just using inexpensive tag board for this. It's fairly heavy, but not too heavy, and you can stiffen them up with 1/4-inch balsa or strips of wood. But it allows me to work on something that can slide in and out of the main case. I always like to start with the hero objects, the main things, the focal point of the actual project. And in this case, it was the ship's wheel with the skeleton. And so I was able to find a ship's wheel model that I 3D printed. And then a lot of these other components for the wheel were based on the Disney ride loosely from the shape, and then just cut out of balsa wood. Now I laser cut them, but these would be easy to cut out of balsa. It's super easy to work with, and just draw them out and a little bit of sanding, and you can create this kind of stuff pretty quickly. The skeleton is going to rest or stand on something that's sort of the ship, where the ship's wheel was mounted to the deck. It's ripped from, the rest of the ship as it crashed into the rocks. And this is a little platform that I'm building. And I'm thinking in terms of, well, how would a ship be built? There would be some beams that support some deck planks, but I want it to be broken and gapped. And it's oddly hard, strangely hard to actually not snap balsa just in a straight, almost 90-degree break. You kind of really have to work at it to get it ragged and jaggedy like this. Here is the basic main platform with just the ship's wheel mounted on it. Here is our skeleton that's been 3D printed. It's been broken apart or cut apart into different sections and then super glued back together. I'm going to slap a lot of paint on this, so it doesn't even have to be that pretty a gluing job. To create additional depth and elevation, I'm just using some standard blue foam insulation. You could really use anything here. You could use expanded foam from packing foam. This blue stuff works well. I have you buy a 4x8 sheet of this stuff at the hardware store and you're kind of in foam for the rest of your life. And you really have no place to put it because it's so huge, and storage is actually a bigger issue than anything. You can see I'm drawing these super exact, precise lines, which really simply doesn't mean anything. I don't know why I do that. The next step is going to be just to chunk it out with the world's cheapest hot wire cutter. And so all of my very careful drawing is a little comical in retrospect. I've done a lot of Googling on how dangerous the fumes from cutting insulation foam are. It ranges anywhere from, it's no big thing to sudden death, but I really use ventilation, have a lot of airflow when you're melting foam with a hot wire. This is kind of my magic trick to make stuff look better. I use this when I'm making plaster rocks as well. It's using a very coarse, very stiff wire brush to just scrub the heck out of the material. I can create a lot of what looks like sedimentary lines. It knocks down all of the sharp edges. It takes something that's looking really weird and funky and kind of artificial, and it tends to help make it look better. As I mentioned earlier, one of the hard things is really creating that sense of space. And so by putting things in the foreground and the middle ground and the background, you can start to hide some of the sense of walls or enclosure because you're obscuring it behind things. It's also narrowing the vision, your eye line. It's confining what you can see by creating sort of these peepholes to look through. Again, I'm doing these really precise drawings, but ultimately at the end of the day, we just want something that's not too regular. And this is going to frame the skeleton as well. Just going to go after it again with that wire brush. This works really great when you're making plaster rocks using tinfoil for your molds. I'm going to throw together a tutorial. There's a bunch out there on the web, but like everyone, I'll do another one. At some point, you have to close up the box. I usually like to work with a side open so I can get into things, but there's a time when you have to commit. For me, commitment's a hard one, but you just got to do it. I'm starting to work now on the actual texture, some additional textures. For this, I'm using resin sand. You could use gel medium mixed with sand. You could glue down some sand. I'm using this also, though, to seal this base. There's going to be a resin pour, and I want to get all of these cracks filled so that it doesn't ooze out and seep out all over my workbench. It's really nice having a little chopper like this when you're making lots of little parts that need to be consistent. Safety tip here, that razor blade that's in there on that arm is really sharp. And I've cut myself reaching in to take a small piece out, so always use a stick or something to kind of kick it away from that blade. I also have one of these nifty magnetic jig things to hold stuff in place when I'm trying to glue them up and keep them square. This was a dumb idea here. I'm going to be honest with you. I glued up a couple pieces of MDF that I laser cut. Everything has to go on the laser these days so that I feel like I'm getting my money's worth out of it. But this should have really been just cut out of thick chunks of balsa. I needed some belaying pins because those are an iconic element of sailing ships. So I 3D modeled these myself. I'm kind of happy with the way they turned out. I will make those files available to folks. I'm always trolling through hobby stores whenever I go in to look for things I can use. In this case, these were some dollhouse spindles that I used for a railing that was going to disguise or hide the back bottom corner of the diorama. This project, I used the airbrush extensively to paint. I probably haven't used it this much since I did the Star Wars diorama. You don't need anything too complicated. This is a Pache H, which is a single action airbrush. It's basically an over glorified spray paint can. It's so simple, it's easy to clean, easy to use, And you really don't need a fancy, expensive double action airbrush for your airbrush painting. One interesting thing about this Nook was there were some sails that I wanted to imply, and so I used some tissue paper, which is really hard to work with, but I pinned it up and draped it and got it wet and then hit it with layers of paint to help sort of stiffen it up and help it hold its shape. Again, the airbrush was really, really handy in this particular project. The overall finishes are really a very, very dark, dark, dark brown as a base, sort of a medium burnt umber kind of color, and then layers of gray. If you look at driftwood or old wood that's been sitting out, it has a gray weathered look. It's like all of the color has been bleached out of it. So it was a lot of different layers of grays and then browns and then darker, and then highlighting it and hitting it from sort of the light source, sort of a zenithal approach. And it worked really well also for the rock. So hitting the rock from a high angle to catch highlights, it was a great way to get a lot of depth very quickly. The thing about nature is that stuff grows everywhere, and I wanted to break up all of this gray with just a little bit of color. So some green washes, a little bit of foam turf really brought some life into the space. And here are the finished hero components. I gave the skeleton some tissue paper clothing. Again, that was not the easiest thing to work with, but it worked out really well. This is the sort of the side of the ship. This implies, I think in my mind, a shipwreck. It looks like the ribs of a ship with some rope, those belaying pins, but some rocks are also integrated into it. This is that back railing that's gonna add some additional shapes and texture to it, and it hides the back bottom edge, the back corner of the back wall. And then this is one of those deck grate things that looks very nautical and very ship-like that will form the foreground. The background is printed on some luster paper so that I get good richness in the color and not a lot of reflection, and it just slides in and wraps around in the background to hide those corners. In preparation for the resin pour, I take a scrap of Plex and hot glue that really well around the edge to make sure I don't end up with any leaks. For this, I'm just using some standard good old resin that I had kicking around. This is not a deep pour, so I don't need to do multiple layers, and I didn't need any special resin. I did actually mix up the colors too dark. Sometimes you gotta be really careful with resin colors. They can get way out of control really quickly. It's better to start with what you think is much too little and then work up to it, than just kind of plunk a bunch of color in there. You can see it's almost opaque, or very, very hard to see. You know, it's the sea, it's the thing. It's not a big part of it. It's not an important part, but it was a little darker than I kind of wanted. For the lighting, I needed a couple flame LEDs to point at the skeleton, so I just used their legs to create little standoffs for them. The rest of the lighting is RGB NeoPixels, and I really love these because I can adjust the color. Unfortunately, down the road, I realized that they weren't quite bright enough for the lightning flashes. I couldn't get that really intense bright white. So I punched a couple holes in the ceiling really carefully to add those LEDs. I love using alcohol-based stains. They dry really fast, they're really easy to use, and you can get these bottles of different colors to mix your own kind of custom formulations. Just mix those in with a little denatured alcohol, and you can really get a whole range of things. So in this case, I've now cut out the face of the Nook and laser cut on it. This is some language from ghostly voices from the ride that's not really part of the ride, I don't think anymore, but it was part of the original ride. And then I'll hit it all with a bunch of water-based polycryl. This is just a satin finish, water-based. I just love water-based materials because I don't want to deal with the fumes and I don't want to deal with the solvent cleanup. I'm going to veneer the outside, and I have some divots from the actual box joints. So I'm just using some wood filler, some spackle to get those depressions filled so that I have a really nice smooth surface for the veneer and I won't end up with any waviness on the edges or the corners. I'm using a walnut veneer to finish the outside, and walnut really is my favorite wood. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. It's great to work with. It smells great when you're cutting and sanding it. And this veneer is super easy to work with. It's very easy to position and reposition. It burnishes down well. This is self-adhesive again. And I just love working with it. You can take something that's kind of marginal and make it look absolutely beautiful. Once everything was positioned and trimmed, I threw it in the laser cutter, because of course I did. Burned some pirate map stuff on it. And then the last thing to do would be to give it several coats of, again, a satin polycryl, and then just bring it home and button it up and call it done.